What's the scariest, 100% true story you've heard? My childhood friend's family had a house on the beach, and we were invited there from time to time. They had money, the house was huge, and it was a pretty cool place. They had their own upper room in the backyard, and they had their own room. One day they went there for a long weekend. It was a total mess. There was no TV, the furniture was broken. There was no TV, the furniture was broken. When they went to check on the maid, her room was empty and all her belongings were gone. I called the police, they came and said they just looked, they weren't interested, and said the maid must have done something and left. He brought the dog in. One of the dogs started digging and found the maid buried under a sheet that was lying by the pool in the back garden. So whoever came in probably knew her, and she recognized them. Late one night, when I had already gone home and gone to bed, I got a phone call from a school friend. She said something had happened and asked if she could come over to my house. She was visibly shaken and wouldn't give any details. I was met at the front door of her house by a policeman with a flashlight on. He asked where I was going, and I told him about the call from my grandmother. Then, as I walked down the hill to cul-de-sac, where she lives, I saw several police cars parked in a circle. They saw me stop and get out of the car. My grandmother ran out of the house and met me in the street. She explained that someone had broken into her neighbor's house and started hitting him with something heavy. The neighbor managed to get out of the house and went to my grandmother's house, where he started banging hard on the front door. The neighbor was lying in the doorway, with blood flowing from his head. Her mother looked up and saw the perpetrator heading towards the front door. She dragged the neighbor into the house, closed the door, and hit the perpetrator with the door before it closed completely. She then took the heavy tool she had been hitting the neighbor with and broke the small window at the top of the door. The mother started screaming and the perpetrator just turned and walked away into the darkness. I spent the night in the house with 2 or 3 officers that night, but in the morning there were still bloodstains on the floor in front of the house and blood splatters on the front door, from where the killer had swung the bloody tool and broken the window. No one was caught or identified. It was completely random. The neighbor survived and, as far as I know, suffered no serious injuries other than a scar on her head. She moved out shortly after the incident. Edited information about the victim's situation, with a paragraph that is probably not true. TDR, my grandmother's neighbor, was brutally attacked in her home. She fled to my grandmother's house and escaped after the perpetrator nearly broke into their home as well. No one was caught. One night my aunt fell asleep on the couch, while my uncle slept upstairs. Around midnight, my aunt woke up to a strange man looking at her. The man upstairs was sound asleep, meaning he came in, saw my aunt sleeping on the couch, looked around, saw my uncle sleeping upstairs, and sat there and watched. The aunt told the uncle to leave, and somehow, with God's help, he did. He snuck into the house through the back door. We live in a relatively safe neighborhood, but that was the craziest thing I've ever heard. I was about 10 years old. I was in school and my mom said she was going to take me to the doctor after lunch. During lunch, when I was in the canteen, an office staff member told me that there was a cab outside and I should go. Since I didn't know how to drive, I figured my mom had ordered it for me. I gathered my things, grabbed my bag and was about to leave when I remembered that I had a jacket in my classroom. I hurriedly grabbed it and headed to the cab. The cab left me where I was. I went straight back to class, but I panicked and my mom got mad at me. School was over and Mom was waiting for me at the gate. With tears in my eyes, I apologized for missing the cab and thought I was in big trouble. My mom had never ordered a cab and didn't know what I was talking about. After all, she never made a doctor's appointment. No one could figure out who ordered the cab or who the driver was. Mom didn't want to think about what might have happened if I had forgotten my jacket and not gotten in the cab. I missed the cab my mom thought she had ordered for me and found out it might have been an attempted kidnapping. The cab driver knew your name. He described you to the woman in the office. He knew my full name and grade. He knew my teacher's name. Maybe it was a different time. Maybe it happened differently at different schools, but I'm surprised they didn't take some kind of identification from the cab driver, and I don't know if that person was authorized by the school to pick you up, because in the early 2000s my parents always said that they were the only ones picking me up after school, that they were the only ones. And I remember them saying that no one else would pick them up. My school always had a strict policy that parents had to have an ID or be listed on the pickup authorization list to pick up their child. Otherwise, they were not allowed to leave the school grounds with the student. Anyway, what happened to you still seems creepy, but luckily you forgot your jacket. It was 1990, so the situation was, to say the least, more peaceful. Anyone could come and go to school at any time. There was no such thing as a listed person. At the same school, my brother was sent home alone when he had a concussion, 20 minutes away. The woman in the office just asked if he needed to go somewhere or if someone would come get him. I answered yes, assuming my mom would drop me off at the appointed time. Cabs would not seem unusual, as they often came to the school to take ESL students or other students somewhere. Later, my father and mother had a big meeting with the administration and the vice principal. They came up with a stricter policy. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had gone without a jacket. It was a very strange event. Now here's my story. When I was young, 56 years old, I had a neighbor who was like a grandmother to me. I would go to her house for candy, and she would play with me with her potato head. It's a strange, deep memory. He was in his early 20s, and I think he came back from the army. I don't remember him well, but he asked if he could take me to my brother's camp. But my mother refused. By the way, we lived in the village. We had no closed doors. We all trusted each other. My mother got worried when she saw him stung by bees in his little store. She said he was stung in the creek. She thought that was strange because it wasn't where he always went, but okay. Sometime later, I don't know how long it had been, news came that some vacationers had been killed near our house. There were no leads, and everyone was shocked. Things like that don't happen here. My mom recalled strange sensations and bee stings that didn't make sense. My mom called the police and said there was probably nothing there, but something like that had happened. I remember the detective coming to the house and talking to my mother. There were other matching clues, but not enough to connect it to the murder. In the case of the couple with a child, detectives said they knew it was him, but the case remains unsolved to this day. A few years later, a man went to prison for kidnapping and attempted murder after driving a woman home when she ran out of gas. She survived. In the village, my grandfather was raised by the Nazis. He had 9 brothers and sisters. The Nazis came to the village in retaliation for the partisan attacks, believing that the partisans were hiding there. Most of the young men ran away before they arrived. The men in the village were lined up against the wall and shot. My grandfather's mother put half of her children, the youngest, in the cellar and took the other half with her, as the Nazis gathered all the villagers and locked them in the church. The Nazis rounded up the whole village and locked them in the church. The children were separated because they were afraid they would all be killed and wanted at least some of them to survive. The Nazis looted and burned almost all the houses in the village. My grandfather was in the basement with his siblings. Their house burned down, but they survived. Some people in the church were also saved, but not many. Some time after that the Nazis came again, and the young men and boys, including my grandfather, were still forced to help build roads and fortifications. They all survived the war, but many of their families did not. To this day, I still search for a logical explanation for this. It happened in 2003 when X and I were staying at a coastal resort where the cottages were about 200 meters apart. At about 11:30 p.m. we were drinking beer together, with the lights off and only the TV on, when suddenly the doorknob rattled violently, as if someone was trying to open it. There was no double lock on the door, so my first reaction was to jump off the bed and block the door with my weight. The inertia of my landing must have been audible from the other side, but the twisting of the doorknob continued. By now I was pressing my face to the floor, trying to see how many people were behind the door, through the small gap between the floor and the bottom of the door. There were no footsteps, and the doorknob kept clanking. It had to be said that the gap between the floor and the door was enough to see what was going on outside, or at least notice the shadows and light changes caused by movement, but nothing was happening. The sound of the doorknob turning stopped, but no footsteps or other sounds were heard. I waited a few minutes and opened the door. All was quiet. There was no sign of anyone outside or on the sand around the cottage. We quickly got out of there. The murder of the Clutter family, masterfully described by Truman Capote in his book In Cold Blood. What really struck me about this case was that one person who knew this family was the catalyst that ultimately cut their lives short. The father's former employee, Floyd Wells, told his cellmate about the Clutter family, and the inmate, Richard Hickok, was convinced that the family kept a large sum of money in a safe in their home. Upon his release, Hickok contacted another former co-defendant, Perry Smith, who planned to rob the family. Neither the safe nor the property turned up. Instead, the two men made off with a small radio, binoculars and less than $50 in cash, as well as the lives of Herb, Bonnie, Kenyon, and Nancy Clutter. Hickok's words about Herb were particularly memorable. I thought he was a very nice gentleman. I thought so until the moment I slit his throat. The legend of the van might bring to mind the Bean Pig episode of South Park, but no, it was more than that. There was a camp we went to in the summer. Probably about 500 kids were there all week. There were cabins there by gender and by age, and in one cabin there was a senior. This senior was about 17 or 18 years old, and he looked after the 13 to 16-year-olds in their cabins, and the staff were adults who had their own cabins, but they were on duty at night, going around and making sure everybody stayed in their cabins. So, now that you have some idea of the setting, let's move on to the legend. In the forest, when all the children are in their cabins and the lights are out, a bear comes out of the depths of the forest and wanders into the camp. The bear gets up on his hind legs and walks like a human. He then decides to go into the cabin, and if you are unlucky, he will go into your bed and watch you sleep. And if you are unlucky, he will walk past your bed and watch you sleep. If you move even an inch, it will grab you and carry you off into the woods, never to be seen again. When I heard this, I was 14 years old and I was terrified. The oldest girl told all of us about it. The other girl said yes, of course, and we went to bed in silence, but the other children in the cabin had heard about it too. I couldn't get it out of my head and always tried not to move when I went to bed. Many years later, I met a staff member who worked at that camp and told him how scary that man-bee was, but that it was a good trick to keep the kids quiet. But that it was a good trick to get the kids to shut up because in the 80s a guy in a bear suit, which was sort of the camp mascot at the time, would lead the girls out of their cabins. As you can imagine, it was scary, and I was completely baffled that Bee-Man even existed. When I was about 18 years old, I went into town for a drink with some friends. By 2 a.m. I was completely drunk, blind, unable to walk or think. One of my friends stayed sober and drove me home. When I got to the parking lot, I heard obscene voices in the dark. Turning around, I saw two men carrying a girl to her car. As I got closer, I heard her voice. She was clearly drunk, but she kept saying "you know G" and "you know J" over and over again. Adrenaline rushed over me, and I sobered up instantly. I yelled at them and immediately called the police. I wasn't fast enough and they managed to get in their car and drive away, but I saw the license plate number and told it to the woman I spoke to at the police station, and she informed me that they arrested two people about 10 minutes later. The scene was very, very scary. It was Germany. The robbery at my house as it happened. I lived with my brother in a basement in a quiet residential neighborhood. There was a sidewalk in front of the house and fences and trees on the sides and back. The only way I could see if anyone was in the basement was through the small window in my bedroom, about 5 feet from my bed. While I was out, I got word that my house had been burglarized. The burglars kicked in the basement door, entered through the back door, and went upstairs. After robbing the basement apartment, they took advantage of a half-hour break when I, my brother, and the people upstairs were not home. In other words, they watched us for days, tracking our behavior patterns. It wasn't the burglars that scared me, it was the fact that I was asleep and they pressed their faces against the window 5 feet from my bed and just watched me. One of the many instances of nocturnal sleep paralysis caused me amnesia. When I was about 7 years old, I woke up in the middle of the night to find a smoky creature crawling under my bed. As you can imagine, it was scary and I ordered a boarding party. In hindsight, I assumed it was sleep paralysis, but wondered to myself. Because in hindsight, I thought it was sleep paralysis. It still happens quite often now, but that time I was fully mobile. When I reached the top of the stairs near my bedroom, another staircase rose slowly, step by step, out of the darkness 1 floor below. I froze and looked around, trying to figure out where else to run, but froze in place as the first of them moved toward me through the bedroom door. Both smoke demons were approaching me, a small 7-year-old child. As the smoke penetrated my vision, my blood pressure rose and I began to lose my sight. My mom came running in. It was the same smoke that came out when I suddenly stood up. My mom eventually carried me back to bed, calmed me down, put me to bed at some point and left. The next morning, I apologized for waking Mom up in the night. Mom had no idea what I was talking about, and we were both confused. I told her I woke you up on the stairs. I was having a nightmare. She said it wasn't last night, it was over a week ago. I don't remember anything about that week, but apparently I went to school every day, played with my friends, ate dinner, did my homework, and watched BS. Apparently, I was somewhat quiet that week, and my mom thought I was having trouble at school. To this day, however, I don't remember anything after that night. I shudder to think about how my body could be living its daily life, and I knew nothing about it. It happened earlier this year. A work colleague had been out of work for a long time. When he came back, we found out that his friend had been killed by a group of soccer jerks. They were in a pub watching a match of the team they were cheering for. They were celebrating the victory when people from the opposing team got angry and started swearing. When my coworker and his friends came out of the pub, they jumped on his friends and hit them hard. This is one of the reasons why I hate soccer and especially England, where I'm from. There are always vans with riot police, hundreds of policemen, and so on around every train station and soccer stadium. These are sad people who are willing to lose their lives just because they got kicked in the airbag. This isn't the first time this has happened, and it won't be the last. Someone has already died at a soccer game. So far I have personally seen 2 people, very obese, sitting on couches unmoving for long periods of time. They ate, urinated and defecated on the fabric couch and stayed there for so long that their skin was destroyed and the fabric was embedded in their flesh. The couches had to be cut out to remove them, and the hospital cut out parts of their buttocks, thighs and back to remove the couch tissue and the overgrown flesh. Both ended up dying from systemic infections related to the wounds. When I was 17, I was out with 2 friends and they suggested we go into the woods to smoke marijuana. I didn't feel like it, so I drove them there and waited in the car. After a while I got bored and decided to go to their place. After walking through the dark forest for a few minutes without turning on the flashlight on my cell phone, I came across a hollow in the path, and on the other side was a bench that was faintly visible in the moonlight. There was a man sitting on the bench and another man standing in front of him, but I could only see his silhouette. After making sure it was my friends, I called out loudly and then walked on. Walking through the woods at night gives me a sense of unease, even if only for a few minutes, so I was cautious at first. However, immediately after my shout, the heads of 2 silhouettes turned in my direction. The person I was sitting on started running towards me at breakneck speed, completely silent. I was absolutely terrified, running in the opposite direction and stumbling as I couldn't see anything. Eventually I got out and locked myself in my car, but I was very worried about my friends. After a minute or so I saw 2 people coming out on a completely different road. They, too, made sure that neither I nor anyone else could see them. One memory of that man running silently down the road still makes me shudder to this day. What the hell was that? The events surrounding a father and son who built a submarine and explored the bottom of Lake Tahoe. It's widely known that Lake Tahoe is one of the deepest lakes in the world, but at its bottom, the combination of nearly ice-cold water and low oxygen content preserved the material for a very long time. There are underwater tunnels between Lake Tahoe and other small lakes, with pockets in which objects can be trapped. There are reports and photos of perfectly preserved Native American Indians, gangsters in striped suits, and giant grizzly bears. It's creepy because there is a lake in the area with 2 names. One is the official name and the other is Dead Baby Lake. This is because the local Indians used to bury their dead babies in the lake and hoped that their spirits would live on. Anyway, father and son went down to the bottom of the lake in a submersible and captured what they saw on film. However, when they reappeared on screen, both were very, very visibly upset and unwilling to talk or show proof of what they had seen. They both blocked the video and said they were not ready for the public to see what they had filmed. The most horrifying story is one that happened before my eyes. I was at summer camp and my group was walking back to the dorm late at night. About 5 people were loitering when a man in dark clothing walked up to our dorm and we approached him. I couldn't make out his face, but there weren't many adults in the camp. He rushed to run at a furious speed and disappeared into a large bush. My companions and I ran after him, thinking it was one of the campers, and ran into the bushes about 5 seconds later, but there was nothing there. It had disappeared. The nearest building was inaccessible from the back of where he was headed and had a small restroom. Behind it was a wooded area that was fully illuminated. The sound of running through the woods was also loud. He had completely disappeared. How could we not find him somehow? Everyone was creeped out. I still can't explain it to this day.